Hello children, let us learn the first chapter of civics, that is power sharing. By the end of the session, we should be able to learn the meaning of power sharing, why power sharing is desirable, that we will learn by referring to the case study of Belgium and Sri Lanka. And finally, the forms of power sharing in modern democracies. Now let us begin. What is power sharing? If you see, there can be two ways of running a government. One is through autocracy or tyranny. In this, the power is concentrated in the hands of a leader or a king. On the other hand, a different system which we call democracy. Of course, this is the most prevalent form of government in modern times. Now, if you see democracy, the power is delegated at different levels or within the same level in the different organs of the government. We can also say that power sharing is a political arrangement in which different or opposing groups all take part in government together. If we refer to the stories from Belgium and Sri Lanka, we see that this idea was taken up in two different ways in both the countries. Let us start with Belgium. If you see the ethnic composition of Belgium, we need to refer to two different regions, one called the Wallonia region, where the French-speaking were in majority, and the other Flemish region where Dutch were in majority. In the Flemish region, 59% of the speakers were Dutch, and in the Wallonia region, 40% of the French were there. If we compare these two communities, French were relatively rich and more powerful, and Dutch speakers did not receive the benefit of education and economic development. As a result, in the decade of 1950s and 60s, there was tension between these two communities, and this tension was more acute in the capital city, Brussels. Now, Brussels presented a totally different scenario. Here, the French were in majority and the Dutch were in minority. However, the Belgian government handled the community difference very well. Between 1970 and 1993, Belgian leaders amended their constitution 4 times and came up with a new model to run the government. Now, what were these elements of the Belgian model? First of all, their constitution prescribed that the number of Dutch and French speakers shall be equal in the central government. Some special laws required the support of the majority of members from each linguistic group. Thus, no single community can make decisions unilaterally. The state governments were not subordinate to the central government. In Brussels, a separate government was made in which both the communities had equal representation. Apart from the central and the state government, there was a third kind of government. This was called the community government. It was elected by people belonging to one language community, the Dutch, the French, and the German speakers. No matter where they lived, this government had the power regarding cultural, educational, and language-related issues. The Belgian model was very complicated, but it helped to avoid civic strife between the two major communities. The European Union chose to have its headquarters at Brussels, as power sharing was practiced successfully over here. Now let us come to Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, Sri Lankan Tamils and the Sinhalese comprised the 2 chunks of population over there. Apart from this, Muslims and Christians were also there. Sri Lankan Tamils occupied the northeastern part of the country, who were both Hindus and Muslims. Out of this, Tamil were 18%. The Sinhalese were almost 74% of the total population and followed the Buddhist religion. Muslim comprised relatively a small chunk of population. They were just 1%. Sri Lanka emerged as an independent country in 1948. In Sri Lanka, Sinhala community enjoyed the bigger majority and imposed its will on the entire country. A number of laws were made to establish Sinhala's supremacy. Out of this, in 1956, an act was passed which recognized Sinhala as the only official language of Sri Lanka, thus disregarding Tamil. They also followed preferential policies that favored Sinhala applicants for university positions and government jobs. Constitution was amended to protect and foster Buddhism. It had a negative impact on the entire country. The measures taken by the government gradually increased the feeling of alienation among the Sri Lankan Tamils. They felt that constitution and government policies denied them equal political rights, discriminated against them in getting jobs and other opportunities, and ignored their interests. The relationship between Sinhala and Tamil communities became very poor. The Sri Lankan Tamils launched parties and struggled for the recognition of Tamil as an official language. They also struggled for regional autonomy and equality of opportunity in securing education and jobs. Their demand was repeatedly denied by the government. The distrust between these two communities turned into widespread conflict and turned into a civil war. Thousands of people from both the communities were killed. Many families were forced to leave the country as refugees, and many more lost their livelihoods. The civil war ended in 2009 and caused a terrible setback to the cultural, social, and economic life of the country. You had learnt about two countries. One was Belgium and one was Sri Lanka. What have you learned from the stories of Belgium and Sri Lanka? It is all between accommodation in Belgium versus majoritarianism in Sri Lanka. Now, if we see the similarity between both these countries, they are democracies. Both of them are democracies. However, there is a difference in the power sharing arrangement that they followed. There was something unique about Belgium, isn't it? What was it? The leaders realized that unity of the country is possible only by respecting the feelings and interests of different communities and regions. There was a drawback that was there in the system followed in Sri Lanka. There, the dominance of majority community, if you see, the majority community was Sinhalese, by refusing to share power with Tamils, resulting in disunity. So now we understand that in modern democracies, power sharing is definitely desirable. There are two reasons. One set of reasons we'll call prudential, and the other set of reasons we'll call moral. It is wise to share power with the different units of the government and with the people. Why? Because it reduces the possibilities of conflict between social groups. It gives stability to the government and it strengthens the unity of the country too. Power sharing is the very spirit of democracy. People have a right to be consulted on how they are to be governed. In modern democracies, there are 4 ways in which power is shared among with the people and with the different organs and the different levels of the government. In the first case, power is shared among different organs of the government: legislature, executive, and the judiciary. This system is also known as the horizontal distribution of power. In the second instance, power is shared between government at different levels. Federal system of government is a very good example for this. There are 3 different levels, one at the center, one at the state, and one at the local self. Power sharing between different social groups, such as religious and linguistic group. Community government in Belgium is a very good example of this arrangement. In some countries, there are constitutional and legal arrangements whereby socially weaker section and women are represented in legislature and administration. In India, the system of reserved constituencies in assembly and the parliament of our country is an example of this form of power sharing. The fourth way in which power is shared is between political parties and social groups. These social groups can be further categorized as pressure groups and movement groups. They control or influence those in power. In a democracy, the citizens must have freedom to choose from various contenders for power. In contemporary democracies, this takes the form of competition among different parties. Such competition ensures that power does not remain in one hand. With this, we conclude the major topic that were discussed. Now let us recapitulate. As you can see on the screen, there is list 1 and list 2. These are the various forms in which power is shared, and in list 2 the example is given. Take a moment to match both the lists. I hope you all have already matched list 1 with list 2. Let us check. Power shared among different organs of the government. This is an example of separation of power. Power shared among governments at different levels. This is an example of federal government. Power shared by different social groups is an example of community government, and power shared by 2 or more political parties is an example of coalition government. Thank you for watching the video. In the next tutorial, we will learn more about power that is shared between different levels of government. That is chapter 2, Federalism.